Hey everyone, welcome back to the channel. And if you are new here, my name is Marcus, and tonight we're going into a story that most people have never heard, a case that slipped through the cracks of national attention, a case that never made the cable news cycle or the true crime podcast circuit, a case that exists in that particular shadow where real human tragedy goes when the world decides it has more important things to pay attention to. And I want to tell you about a woman named Sandra Elaine Beaumont, a 31-year-old librarian from Baton Rouge, Louisiana, whose life was taken from her on a Thursday evening in March of 1994, in circumstances so strange and so deliberately concealed that even the detectives who worked the case hardest will tell you today that they never fully understood what they were looking at. Sandra was born on June 4, 1962, the oldest daughter of a sugarcane farmer named Earl Beaumont and his wife Lorraine. She grew up in a small community called Grosse Tete, about 25 miles west of Baton Rouge, where everybody knew your name and your grandparents' names and the names of your dogs. She was the kind of girl who read 3 books at once and kept a journal and pressed flowers between the pages of her favorite novels and spent her summers cataloging the birds she spotted in the bayou behind her family's property. She was quiet in the way that people who are most alive inside their own minds are often quiet, not withdrawn, not antisocial, but deeply interior, deeply observant, the kind of person who noticed everything and said only what she had decided was worth saying. She graduated near the top of her class from high school, attended Louisiana State University on an academic scholarship, majored in library science with a minor in Southern American history, and by 1989 she was working at the East Baton Rouge Parish Library System's main branch on Goodwood Avenue. Her colleagues described her as meticulous and warm and funny in a dry, understated way that crept up on you. She remembered the reading preferences of every regular patron. She organized storytelling hours for children on Saturday mornings that became so popular parents had to arrive 40 minutes early to get a seat. She was building a quiet and meaningful life in a city she loved. And then, in early 1993, something changed. Something that Sandra's closest friend, a woman named Paulette Arsenault, who had known her since the 3rd grade, noticed before anyone else did. Sandra became careful in a way she had not been before, careful about what she said on the phone, careful about who she mentioned in conversation, careful in the way that people become careful when they know something they are not sure what to do with. Paulette would later tell investigators that she asked Sandra directly what was going on in the fall of 1993, and that Sandra had said she had found something at work that she was trying to figure out, something in the archive materials, something in a collection of donated private papers that the library had received from the estate of a recently deceased Baton Rouge businessman named Gerald Fontenot. Fontenot had been a prominent figure in Louisiana state contracting circles throughout the 1970s and 1980s. He had died in August of 1993 at the age of 78 and had left a substantial bequest to the library system, including a large collection of personal and professional documents that had been delivered to the archive room where Sandra worked. And whatever was in those papers was what Sandra had found, and whatever she had found was what changed her. Paulette said Sandra had used the word dangerous once, had said she was not sure what to do with something dangerous, and then had changed the subject and had not brought it up again. And 3 weeks after that conversation, Sandra Elaine Beaumont was dead, her body found on the evening of Thursday, March 10, 1994, in her car in the parking lot of a grocery store on Airline Highway. She had been strangled. Her car was locked from the inside. No signs of forced entry, no signs of struggle outside the vehicle, no witnesses who reported seeing anything unusual. Just a woman in a parked car in a public parking lot who had been murdered with extraordinary deliberateness and who had been left there for someone to find. The initial investigation was handled by the Baton Rouge Police Department, and it moved the way investigations move when they do not have an obvious direction to go. Detectives interviewed Sandra's colleagues, her family, her neighbors. They looked at her personal life for the usual variables: a difficult relationship, a financial dispute,
a conflict with someone close to her. They found nothing. Sandra was universally described as someone who did not have enemies, who did not have complicated entanglements, who lived a life of such fundamental decency that the idea of anyone wanting to harm her seemed to everyone who knew her to be incomprehensible. The Fontenot archive connection surfaced early because Paulette told investigators immediately about the conversation she had had with Sandra, told them about the word dangerous, told them about the timing, and investigators went to the library and they looked at the Fontenot papers, and what they found when they got there was that the archive had been accessed the night before Sandra's body was found, accessed after hours, using a key that Sandra herself possessed, but that she had not used that evening because she was found in a grocery store parking lot miles away. Someone else had used access to those materials that night, and someone had removed a significant portion of the Fontenot collection. Exactly which documents were removed was difficult to determine because the cataloging of the new acquisition had been Sandra's project, and she was the only person who had a complete understanding of what the archive contained. The library's accession logs showed a large intake, but the internal catalog that Sandra had been building was stored on a personal diskette that was found wiped in her desk drawer. Whoever had accessed that archive after hours had not only removed documents, but had erased the record of what had been there, which means that whoever did this knew exactly what they were looking for and exactly how to prevent anyone from knowing what had been taken. And that level of specificity and that level of operational precision is not the work of a random criminal. That is the work of someone with resources and planning and a very specific reason to make sure that whatever Gerald Fontenot had kept in those papers never became part of the public record. The investigation stalled within months. There were no fingerprints recovered from the archive room that did not belong to library staff. The car offered no biological evidence that could be usefully analyzed with the technology of 1994. The removed documents could not be identified because the only person who knew what they contained was dead. The case went cold in 1995, and it stayed cold for 17 years. 17 years during which Sandra's mother, Lorraine, wrote letters to the Baton Rouge Police Department every single year on the anniversary of her daughter's death. 17 years during which Paulette Arsenault kept the case alive in conversations with anyone who would listen. 17 years during which Gerald Fontenot's name meant nothing to anyone investigating Sandra's murder, because there was no way to reconstruct what was in those papers without the papers. And then, in 2011, a retired Louisiana state archivist named Theodore Moe was going through a storage unit he had rented in the 1990s to hold overflow materials from a project he had been working on, and he found something. He found a box of photocopies, copies he had made himself years earlier of documents from various Louisiana state contracting archives as part of a research project on infrastructure corruption in the post-oil bust period of the 1980s. And among those photocopies were documents that bore Gerald Fontenot's name and signature, documents that showed a pattern of payments from state contracting accounts to a series of shell companies that Theodore Moe had always assumed were legitimate subsidiaries, but that, in the context of everything he now knew about Louisiana corruption, looked considerably less legitimate. And one of those documents referenced a 1981 transaction that involved not just Fontenot, but two men who, in 2011, were still alive, still connected to Louisiana business and political circles, and still very much invested in the idea that their connection to Gerald Fontenot's financial arrangements would never become a matter of public knowledge. Theodore Moe did not immediately understand the significance of what he had found. He was a retired archivist, not a detective, but he was a careful man, and he was a thorough man, and he did what careful, thorough people do.
He searched the internet for Gerald Fontenot's name, and he found the obituary, and he found the library bequest, and he found a small archived news article from 1994 about the murder of a Baton Rouge librarian who had been processing a donation from the Fontenot estate. And Theodore Moe picked up the phone, and he called the Baton Rouge Police Department, and he told them what he had found. And that phone call, after 17 years of silence, reopened Sandra Beaumont's case. The cold case unit that examined Theodore Mew's photocopies was able to identify the two men referenced in the 1981 transaction. One had died in 2003, but the other, a 74-year-old retired businessman named Clifton Arcand, who lived in a gated community outside Shreveport, was very much alive. Investigators began building a picture of Arcand's relationship with Fontenot, began tracing the shell company transactions, began reconstructing through financial records and state archive materials what Sandra Beaumont might have stumbled across in those donated papers. And what they found was a thread that connected Fontenot and Arcand to a network of fraudulent state contracting arrangements that had diverted millions of dollars from Louisiana infrastructure projects throughout the 1980s, arrangements that had never been prosecuted because the evidence had either been destroyed or had never surfaced, arrangements that, if documented, would have exposed Arcand to serious criminal liability even in 2011. Investigators also found something else. They found phone records from early 1994 showing multiple calls from a number connected to a real estate company that Arcand controlled to a number registered to a man named Denny Broussard, who was a former Iberville Parish Sheriff's deputy with a history of doing private security work for Louisiana business interests. Broussard had died in 2007, but his phone records from 1994 placed him in Baton Rouge in the week before Sandra's murder and in the week of Sandra's murder, placed him at a location less than a mile from the Goodwood Avenue Library branch. Investigators could not build a criminal case that met the prosecutorial threshold required for charges. Clifton Arcand was elderly. The documentary evidence of his connection to Sandra's murder was circumstantial. The key witnesses were dead, and the documents that Sandra had actually found were gone, burned or shredded or buried in the 17 years since someone had walked into that archive room and taken them. In 2013, the Baton Rouge District Attorney's Office reviewed the reinvestigation and declined to prosecute. The case went cold again. Clifton Arcand died in 1916 at the age of 79 in his gated community outside Shreveport. He was never charged with anything connected to Sandra's death. Sandra's mother, Lorraine, died in 2018 without ever receiving the answer she had written letters for 24 years trying to obtain. And Paulette Arsenault, who is still alive, who still lives in Baton Rouge, who still lights a candle for Sandra every March, has told the few journalists who have covered this case over the years that she believes she knows what happened, that she believes Sandra found something in those papers that powerful people needed to stay hidden, and that those powerful people made sure it stayed hidden in the most permanent way available to them. And she is probably right. The architecture of what investigators reconstructed in 2011 and 2012 points clearly enough in a direction that the word probably feels inadequate. And the fact that no one was ever held accountable, the fact that the documents are gone and the witnesses are dead and the case is cold again, is a kind of answer in itself. It tells you something about how power operates and about how the machinery of concealment works when it is operated by people with enough resources and connections to make things disappear. Sandra Beaumont was a 31-year-old librarian who loved books and birds and the people who came into her library on Saturday mornings to hear stories. She found something she was not supposed to find, and she was killed for it. And the thing she found was destroyed, and the people who killed her were never punished, and the world mostly never knew her name. And that is the story. That is the whole terrible story. And the reason I tell it is because stories like Sandra's are the ones that most need to be told, the ones where the cover-up worked, where power won, where the truth never fully surfaced, because even an incomplete truth spoken into the world is better than a silence that lets the powerful rest easy. Remember Sandra Elaine Beaumont and never stop asking what people in positions of power need you not to find.